Hello, everyone. This is Chen, your friend, cultural historian for early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. And today, with me to continue our discussion about the relationship between finitude and infinity is my dear friend Aran. How are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing good, Trent. Good to be with you. I'm a philosophy instructor and researcher based in Austin, Texas. And yeah, I look forward to our discussion today.
So in our previous episode, we thought we were gonna cover the whole of like the remaining passages that are on limits, finitude, and infinity, but then realized that we were out of time and infinity is not a concept we want to rush through. So we decided spontaneously to kind of make an independent episode about infinity out of this channel. So voila, this is the here we are. So we will continue our discussion about the implications of the relationship between something and other, as explicated by Hegel and in our episode today. So, what do you take us from there, please, Maran? So,
Yes, of course. Yeah, so the idea of the finitude, that like there are some mysterious parts for us that we try to and be open about them. But the idea of finitude is that it's another extension of the negation, and the idea of negation, that something embodies negation, and this idea that not only there must be something other than something as a form of negation, not, and also there must be change within the something as self-negation. But this self-negation has an ultimate point, which is finitude, that something ceases to be something, right? Not ceases to be in the sense of there is a limit, external limitation, but it's a limitation that is imposed internally, right? And here we have the idea of finitude, right? That the something must be finite, basically, right? Now, in talking about this, like in talking about finitude, um, something interesting happens. And that interesting thing is the way that Hegel and Holgate accordingly talk about how this concept of finitude really takes us to the concept of infinity, right? And there are different like levels of this. At least initially, the idea is very kind of spontaneous in the sense that uh, like its immanence is rather justifiable to a good extent, in the sense that we don't just say that okay, that's finitude, we got finitude, but what is infinity, right? It's not an independent question that just comes into the view. It comes as a result of like an organic development in the concept. The idea is, as the Holgate writes, that things do indeed come to a definitive end, but their end is always their transformation into something else.
that's you.
This is um, to say that yes, things are around, demise is part of them, they experience demise, but they don't just like it's just like, it's not like nothing, it's not end really. It's just like a new thing, a new finite thing, right? And as Howard puts it, it's not like the wood is like destined to be ash, but wood is destined to be something else, right? Maybe like wood, we just add some element to wood, and it doesn't turn into ash; it turns into something quite different. But it is a part of it. Like if you leave it alone, it's going to change. If you try to preserve it, it also changes. It's there's no escape from this, which takes us back to the point that has been a theme in our conversations. This means that for Hegel, not only there is no absolute vacuum or radical gap, but also there is no absolute nothingness. Like it's not that the world could just get destroyed in its entirety, and what all we get is just there's nothing else. There's no world, right? That doesn't make any sense. And if we take Holgate seriously, because that doesn't make sense conceptually, that means it doesn't make sense ontologically as well. Meaning that there is something about being and nothing that kind of, or yeah, being and nothing, that they cannot exist without each other, right? As much as there is no being that is just flat existence, pure immediate existence, there is no nothing that is just not, there's just, that's it, pure nothingness. That means that there is no absolute end. There is no absolute end. And I guess from the inference, there is no absolute beginning either. It's just like it's going. And it doesn't have that end. Still, there are finite things that have the structure that Hegel has talked about. Um, they come about, they disappear, but then another thing comes about, right? And then another comes about, another things come about. And this is where infinity starts to emerge. Holger writes, every finite thing contributes through its own demise to the continuous constitution of that infinite, never-ending being. So what happens is that now our focus is not wood becoming ash, ash becoming dust, dust becoming soil, soil becoming plant, but that whole thing, right? That is moving out, and all of this. And that doesn't mean there's any sort of transcendence into this never-ending being. It's just that. It's just that process of one after another, one after another. Um, so again, another kind of parallel for those of you who are familiar with Spinoza, that conception of God, uh, and how it kind of gets connected to the concept of nature, and Spinoza's problem with like transcendence in general, right? This infinity is immanent. This infinity is not transcendent, right? And I remember Holger using a term that I really liked, that was something along these lines, that infinity needs the grace of finitude for its existence, right? Like it's not that infinity is something that's on top and then there's the finite things, it is something through that, right? And this whole idea that I just kind of said in a compact way is gonna show itself to us in different ways. Basically, in different ways that infinity can be misunderstood, right? So we're gonna come back to that in a second. But Trent, so far, any ideas?
Yes, I just want a second. I think the point you made about the whole transition from finitude to infinity fits Hegel's definition or standards of the immanence is an important one, because it's not that we have finitude, it's like a being and a negation, whatever, or nothing, and positive and negative, they come in pairs, so therefore there must be its opposite. No, it's like, as precisely what you said, that's the logical conclusion that following all the conclusions that were like features that we discerned in the logic of a being at this up till this stage, internal interiorated sense of the negation leads to finite beings, but finite beings, they together, the being is always there for the self-negation, whatever, to be possible. So being is never ending and therefore constituted like a thing that does not decay together with the decay of any finite being. So that's a very, so to speak, like organic process of generating the concept of infinity. I think this has been very clear on this side. Shall we just press on?
Yeah, and I like the way that you use the term, like by the grace of the decay, the undecaying can be, which is this kind of like infinity, just intertwined with the finitude. Yeah. So what the next like move here though is to see like how this idea of infinity could be understood in a bad way, right? And we talk about this, like we're going to talk about this in our critical conversation about infinity. of like what exactly is this like part doing? Is he just talking about bad concepts? Is he thinking that these bad infinities actually exist? Like it's just it's a matter of debate. But the idea is that like a pause here, right? Finite things turn into one another. Hey, infinity is popping up. What is infinity, right? And one of the ways to respond to that question of what is infinity, according to Hegel, was say that okay, infinity is the opposite of finitude, right? Whatever finitude is, infinity is not that, right? Um, and Hegel called this bad or schlechte infinity. Like it's bad because of the reasons that we're gonna see. But the main idea is that like that kind of a pattern that we have talked about this kind of like the more you try to stick to purity, the more impure you get, right? The more you try to kind of like limit your boundaries to remain your purity, the more you are at the mercy of this other. And this becomes a problem with infinity that I want to say, linguistically, and this is going to be a problem that we are going to combat. Seems to be something that is overcoming finitude, or it doesn't have the limitation of the finitude. But if infinity is the opposite of finitude, that means that there is a limit that says, okay, here's finitude. Finitude ends, infinity begins, right? And if that's the case, that means infinity is limited. And infinity is limited, infinity is not really infinite, or is not really, yeah, it's not what it should be, maybe. Like we talk about like what it is not. What it is that it is definitely not living up to the idea of infinity insofar as that idea incorporates some level of lack of limitation, right? Because of its limitation, it's finite infinity. That's another name that Hegel ascribes to that. And Holgate comes up with some examples of existing bad infinities. So definitely, according to Holgate, bad infinity is something that is actually existing. He says, example of actually existing bad infinity is human consciousness or thought itself, insofar as it understands objects to be fundamentally distinct from itself. What I understand is that human consciousness connect to the objects, but connects to the object as something that is entirely other. It keeps connecting, keeps connecting, keeps connecting, but it's the distance never ends. The example is very odd to me. The example that we talked about with Trent in our conversation prior to this that I remembered from phenomenology of spirit uh, is like, and this is I'm borrowing this from Terry Pinkard that uses Goethe's Faust and in other writings Mozart's Don Giovanni as an example of this. That like the pursuit of impulse, continuous pursuit of impulse, is a form of bad infinity. Like instead of establishing a relationship, um, doing like one understand after one understand after one understand after one understand, is this kind of like uh, one thing comes and ends, and then you have to repeat from the zero, and then we have to repeat from zero, repeat from zero, repeat from zero. So these are just some ideas here that might kind of I think the main it's one of those things that I think the examples might not be as helpful because I think the idea is pretty simple. If finitude is contingent about some limitation and infinity has the limit of not being finite, then infinity is finite. The infinity is not really infinite. And I think that's the idea here.
Yes, I like what you just said, and in our previous discussion, it's been very clear to us that whether there can be actually existing bad infinities is an important question. And Hoge, and like in his articulation at least, suggests like there are like real examples. So that poses a question that so bad infinity is it like state of being that is like intrinsic in every state of being that we can observe, or it can be a category of its own with its own like determination of identity, something you could recognize around you. But I think like bad infinity is a great point where like Hegel's science of logic could offer to at least to history or to social science, because like when we do any kind of interpretive work, we necessarily comes up with certain categories which very much, in my current understanding, corresponds to the should or like that uh, unchanging category concept, and that sort of manifested in the sense that, in my understanding, as a kind of bad infinity. Like we have essentialized the categories like this a specific state, like as if like there's no change to how the state operated sort of across the centuries, and because it does not, as you mentioned, like incorporate or in conversation with the finite thing. It wants nothing to do with those finite things. It's kind of a polluting taboo that like that thing could not really deal with. Therefore, it was limited. Therefore, self-contradictory to a certain extent. But while listening to what you said, the second point I have is like I wonder whether this sentence, like that we have on the screen at this moment, like Holgate's an example of human consciousness. Could that be understood as a kind of reference to Descartes' concept of I or ego? That kind of like, or maybe even Kant's the concept of like human consciousness, not like, so it's just a philosopher's category instead of like actual human consciousness as like something a universal category referring to. Like that's just a random thought.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure about, and I think that goes back to the original point that you said, like it's, in what sense we are saying bad infinity exists in the world. Because bad infinity could exist in the world in the sense of a bad conception of consciousness. That doesn't mean consciousness itself is representing bad infinity, right? So it's not just a category of being, it's just like a bad way of self-understanding. I'm not sure. I think Hegel definitely thinks that in Descartes and Kant, there is a gap. There is like
Right. Insurmountable.
things over there kind of a problem, right?
Right.
Things are over there, I is over here. So any relationship between the two is definitely not gonna be the same like way of what we're going to see as true infinity. It's going to be okay. You connect, you come back. You connect, you come back. You connect, you come back. And I think it's that type of thing. And even like in the progress to infinity that we're going to talk about in a second, I think that's going to be very clear. I'm very interested in the point that you mentioned about like the parallel to the state and the bad infinity. And I think this is a very important thing there that um, in a very weird way, it gets connected to so many different things. And I think one of them is that like the state as a something that is transcending,
Mm.
it's like its parts and kind of like trying to impose itself as the upper thing on top of them. I think there's going to be something there, and the idea of it, talking about state and love, these are not accidental. Hegel talks about this. Like, spoilers alert, Hegel thinks love and modern state are examples, expressions of true infinity. Like that's what he thinks, which means there are versions of quote unquote bad states that are not representative of true infinity, and there might be that. What I think is important here so far is that this concept of infinity wants to transcend finitude completely. And I think that's going to be something that is very important in all of these things. And I want to even refer to our conversation about the Zolan in Rose and Zolan as we discussed in the last session. Because remember that Zolan is also the Zolan of Julian Rose, please, in the form of kind of a moral transcendence from the existing social relations has the same kind of a relationship. You want to get out of this like rhythm and be standing on top of it. And in some way you really become the exact opposite. You become the victim
Mm.
of that transcend. The more you try to transcend in that way, the more you become limited,
Right.
like what you are opposing. These are some ideas um, that we can come back to later on. But I think it's important to acknowledge the possible parallels. We are not still sure how to identify bad infinity, because a lot of these points that we are saying about the state and love and things of that nature do not necessarily need the concept of infinity. They could be about like identity in general or
Mm.
transcendence in a different way. How these all going to get connected to infinity is something that is going to pop up in our conversation later on.
Right.
But the move that Hegel makes is that, okay, if you have bad infinity, right, on the one hand, an infinity must overcome finitude on the other, then what we get is that, okay, finitude, we have bad infinity. What is bad infinity? What is opposed to finitude? Oh, that means that this finitude, this infinity is itself finite. Oh, so okay, let's introduce another infinity that is opposed to this finite infinity, right? Now we have a new infinity that is opposed to the finite infinite. But how do we describe that? Oh, it's the opposite of the finite infinite. Well, again, that means that it's limited, it's finite. You have a new finite infinity, and so on and so forth, right? And Hegel himself makes this connection between this spurious infinity and Zolan. He writes, this spurious infinity, uh, he recreated infinity, is in itself the same thing as the perennial odd. It is the negation of the finite. It is true, but it cannot in truth free itself from it, right? It just keeps like reintroducing, keeps reestablishing itself as something finite, right? By trying to overcome finitude in this way, it just keeps reestablishing itself as a finite. It never reaches infinity, right? And in that sense, it becomes Zola. And I think this is interesting, like how these concepts are getting connected here, and whether Hegel's like mentioning of Zolan here is a reference to his understanding of Zolan in the prior section, or something that probably is um, more like the way that Rose understands it, or maybe these are very much interconnected. These are all interesting points. But the idea is that the progress to infinity, uh, Vergessens Unendliche, is the process in which this finite infinity, infinity opposing finitude, keeps getting regenerated. And again, we have this question whether this is actually existing in the world, or this is like a bad conception, or we can find actual examples. But yes, these are the two bad versions of infinity. Any thoughts, Trent?
Yeah, so well, the only thing I want to say here is the connection between this whole process towards the into infinity with Hegel's overarching intolerance of absolute claim of purity. I feel if you look at each stage of a movement from like a finite to the infinite, it's like utter rejection of that finitude and like replacing the previous bad infinity with a new infinity. It was replaced was also that kind of absolute exclusion, which resulted in a claim or obsession over purity that brings onto its own demise because like it cannot tolerate a synthesis with the finite beings. So yes, I think this whole graph diagram on the screen neatly showcases how Hegel's sort of overarching principle or understanding of like um, being and nothing must coexist, and they absolute purity does not correspond to like being at any stage with this specific example. Yes.
I think that's an excellent comparison. Yes, I think that's at the core of this. This is another example of how absolute purity falls short on its own terms. And like it's just the more you try to assert absolute purity, the less purity we really actually get. And this is going to be present in the way that Hegel is gonna talk about true infinite. This slide I just wanted to I think it's a very good summary of what we have talked about in Holgit's words, and I think it's worth just reading it. We don't need to talk about it, we have talked about it, but I think it's interesting. Holgit writes, "This progress starts from the finite, since being proves to be finite before it proves to be infinite, and as we have seen, this finite immediately points beyond itself to and passes over into the infinite. This infinite, however, is bounded by the finite that it transcends, and so itself immediately turns into something finite. As such, it points beyond itself to the infinite, which once more proves to be bounded and finite. This process whereby the finite points beyond itself to yet another finite goes on endlessly." Okay. So I think that's just like a good summary of what we have talked about these bad versions of infinity. Now, what is the good infinity, right? What is the difference between all of this stuff about finite infinity, spurious infinity, and what Hegel considers the true infinity? Now, there are some stuff that are still very enigmatic for me here. And yes, I'm not entirely sure about this, and I know that this understanding of the concept of true infinity in some ways is like the the heart of the system. Like I think this structure is going to repeat itself in throughout Hegel's logic. Now there are a couple of things that I think I understand about true infinity that I will mention those, and then we can take it from there. One of the things is that the true infinity must not oppose finitude, but must embrace it as a moment, right? So true infinity is not reducible to the finite, but it has finitude as part of it, right? In that sense, it cannot stand in opposition to finitude, but it must embody finitude as a part of it, right? So Holgate writes in terms in describing true infinity, that he says, since it is explicitly mediated by the self-negation of the finite and the bad infinite, this new infinite, self-relating being cannot set itself apart from the finite and the bad infinite as immediately different from them, but must incorporate them explicitly within its own logical structure. So that just means, to me, that here is just like another one of those realizations that, okay, we had the finitude, we had this opposing thing that seemed to be absolutely different, right? And that created a chain of like a back and forth, right? Now, this back and forth is not a back and forth of two absolutely different things, but it's a back and forth of different moments of the same thing. This reminds me of the structure of becoming, right? That the original idea was, okay, we have being, we have nothing, right? Being collapses into nothing, nothing collapses into being, and it seems like we have two different things. But the fact that they are collapsing into one another means that they are not these like isolated realms. Absolutely. Therefore, we need to understand being and nothing as moments. And then we have the like, with the transition we have the becoming, with the Dasein we have them as the moments, right? With the Dasein we get to this kind of a stable position, that this becoming of one to the other, moving one from to the other, wasn't the becoming of two absolutely different things, but it was just like a different moments of the same thing, right? I think it's in the same way this idea of finitude and like its opposite, right? And this process of like, you have finitude, you have this opposite, you have finitude, then you opposite, you finitude and opposite. That is the endlessness that we are looking for, right? That process of kind of continuous interconnection between the two. Now, Hegel also writes that in Hegel's view, we can understand the nature of true infinity only when we give up the idea that differing from always amounts to being other than. Precisely such an idea of difference is to be found in the relation between a process and its moments, right? So the idea in abstract of true infinity is the idea of this process that transcends and returns to finitude continuously. That's the process. That's how true infinity needs to be understood. Now, the last slide is going to be some examples and some ideas, some other ideas, and that for me, those ideas and examples make more sense than this abstract understanding of the process. But before moving there, I want to hear you, Trent. What do you have for true infinity so far?
What I have for true infinity is very much like examples or things that we can. I think it will be better to like discuss them when we introduce the concrete examples. Yes.
Let's do it then. Let's do it then. So the last slide that we are going to talk about is that number one, Hegel tells us that like if true infinity is the real deal, right? That's what it is. It's just like that's the process. These are like kind of like that doesn't mean finite things are not existent or anything, but kind of like this ends up being the truth of the finitude, right? The process beneath it, right? Just like um, this might be not a perfect example, but just came to my mind in terms of like you have this living organism, you have another living organism, this predator eats the prey, things happen in nature. What is really underlying all of this is that life, right? It's the continuity of life that is what is happening there, right? It is happening through all of these living beings coming to be and demise and change and transform and all of that. What the throbbing vein, what is just going through all of these things is life itself, right? And it is the thing that is not like immediately evident and present, but that's the thing, right? Something that is just continuously present in uh, in the process of transformation of finite things, right? And that's the real thing. And when I say that that's the real thing, I think it's a little bit like when we think about like laws of physics as being the real thing. Like you see stuff, you see things happening, going on, but there's that kind of an invisible presence of like a threat, like a continuity of like what is the case. That these are just expressions of it, these are just moments of it, right? That doesn't mean that there is any meaningful way to think about laws of physics as absolutely transcending any objects, right? Laws of physics make sense through the objects, but it is their truth. The truth of objects is laws of physics, right? I think that's how one of the ways that I understand is kind of like not sticking to finitude. And there are some like these are some examples. Now, Hegel talks about a couple of other examples that I also think are relevant, and I'm going to read that code. He says a self-recognition that one finds in love, in communal life, and also in knowledge of the world around one, but that one enjoys only as long as one is alive. Such self-recognition in the other is thus a quality of infinite life that every human being can enjoy for a limited, finite amount of time. Now, I think the point about the point about love is interesting. The point about self-recognition is interesting. The point about a state that Hegel doesn't like, Holgate or Hegel do not talk about it here necessarily, but the philosophy of right is rampant, is very interesting because it is this idea of some level of a transcendence, but a transcendence that is always there, the grace of the finite, right? It is never fully transcending, but it's categorically different than the finite things. In the case of love, is just like this kind of like a love somehow transcending the atomized distinction between the two beings that are in love. I think that's the analogy there, right? That when you have two people in love, then still being some atomized, distinct individuals, they become moments of a unit, right? That includes both of them as moments of it, right? They are creating that, but that what they create kind of like starts to transcend them and create something beyond their limitation. I think that's part of it. The part about the state that has the expression of the infinity is again in its relationship with its constituting moments, that it is kind of transcending them, but it is not above them, just like a wholly untouchable state will be above its constituting parts. Yeah, in that sense, all these examples have some flaws, of course, but I think the idea of process and moments, the idea of transcendence that never become fully transcendent, but it is also not reducible to the moment, and these are important. And this is the last thing I'm gonna say, is that to me there is something about language that really feels like that, and that in the sense that also language is something that is nothing without language speakers of a kind at a certain time, right? But at the same time it kind of transcends each individual, right? The English language doesn't disappear, just me and you die, right? It's just it has a life of its own, but that life of its own is also dependent on the moments that are constituting it, right? When I think about true infinity, I think about this type of a relationship. It's the type of relationship between language, English language, and individual speaker. Definitely, the individual speaker is language doesn't make sense unless it is run through the individual language speaker. But language is transcending the individual speaker as having its own life, not reducible to some of those moments. These are some thoughts. I think we are clear on what the bad infinite and the spurious infinity, progress to infinity are. The true infinite is still something that is not absolutely clear. But I have these ideas and these examples. Tren, what about you?
Yes, just like you, very interested in the relationship between bad and true infinity, and the examples that I think of. I have two examples. One is the concept of so-called dynastic circles in China, Imperial China's history. Basically, Imperial China lasted for 2 millennia. You have like a dozen dynasties. So whenever a dynasty came to an end, a new dynasty would claim its own legitimacy over the previous one on account of a unchanged abstract concept that right now the mandate of heaven has moved from you to me. So like we can perhaps using this Hegelian vocabulary, if we're trying to like take Hegel's logic out of its own context and apply it to guide other conceptualization, is that postulate concept, kind of idealized visions like the kingdom of heaven, that sort of thing, is the bad infinity to a certain extent, because it rejects change and it rejects like limitation posed on like the whole community by whatever means is the ideal we should strive for. But it allows the true infinity comes to be in the sense that, especially the second quote you put on the screen, that every human being can enjoy for a limited, finite amount of time. Like every imperial dynasty can last for a certain amount of time, and that self-recognition was baked into the theory of a mandate of heaven, which therefore there is a dynastic circle argument that each dynasty fulfills a specific and historical role or function. Like what remained like unchanged was this, to a certain extent, essentialized identity for being like holder of that mandate of heaven. So like a bad infinity to a certain extent, I don't know. This is just me thinking aloud. Conditions the real practice of a true infinity. Like what's their relationship? So that's, I think, a really interesting um question I want to explore more, especially in applying Hegel's concept into like cultural history. Yes, there's a similar things to your like language point that perhaps like individual language speakers, when they are using certain speech act, they would conceptualize, oh, this word sound means this, and they don't necessarily have a very mature understanding that like sound and also meaning changes always across the time. Yet they're kind of misguided or like naive understanding of this, in fact, contributed to the coming about of like true infinity. Like those are the thoughts I had, like in response to your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, in all of these examples, yeah, it's interesting because yeah, I see the signs of there is something about true infinity that is present in all of these examples, but I think we still need to explore this idea more, and we might even spend some time at some point like a more focused idea of like infinity as its own thing. But I think there is something very important that at least we can there are a couple of things that I think as this final point we can appreciate from the discussion even without a full understanding of true infinity. And the idea is number one, like finitude and infinity, how they get connected, right? Infinity coming out of uh, finitude, and because of that, it's kind of like dependent on it. And that is something that is definitely not present in a concept of infinity that wants to oppose finitude, right? Anything that wants to oppose finitude is not appreciating this dependency condition. But the dependency condition is also refusing to be like, it's not finitude either, right? It is finitude, it's constituting part, but it is not an exhaustive explanation of it, right? So when we think about this kind of like endless chain of finitude after finitude after finitude, finite being after finite being and finite being, that tells us that not only finite beings are constituting parts, but this constant movement from one to the other is the constituting part, right? And this whole thing becomes the process that we call true infinity. Um, I think this is a fertile ground for a lot of ideas, or at least escaping many flawed conceptions of difference and purity, and of course, infinity as well. And I also wonder, for someone who would be interested in the theological implications of this, right? Like in what sense this could be related to um like the religious space in the broader sense of the word. And again, the final thing that I'm going to say is just like in Spinoza's God, right? Again, it's something that is through all the Spinoza's God does not transcend the finite beings in the sense that it is a transcendence being separated from them. then now we might wonder how it is connected to the finite beings. Because that's a problem that a lot of theistic approaches have. That if you have this kind of a transcendent God, what is the relationship between transcendent God and the world? Or what is the relationship between the transcendent God, if the transcendent God is somehow also present in the world, how is it kind of like embodies like the evil that is happening in the world, right? How much is it part of everything, right? Is it part of like the torture of a baby as well? Or no, it's detached, that's not God, right? And I think the point that like Spinoza's God is a far more kind of a sober God. It's not good or evil or anything like that. It just is, right? It just is through all of these finite acts. It is in the same way that the law of physics is. It is in the same way that language is. It's not about. It is not a moral concept, right? It is just like an ontological fact that these things, through all of these things turning into one another, there is this kind of an invisible thread as the process. All of these are expressions of partial expressions of that process, but none of them exhausts what that process is. So I think this idea of true infinity has a lot of there's a lot of room for further exploration of it in any area that we end up talking about. Any final thoughts, Trent?
No, I think you did a great job in summarizing what insight of we have derived from this section and what are the things that we are looking forward to and what are the things that we are not so sure about. So we're inviting the listeners to contribute to. Yes, and with that, I think we could have just concluded our episode. So, dear listeners, stay tuned. Our Hoge's opening of the Hegel's Science of Logic retrospect is coming up next.